The idea of power is seductive, but its preservation is far more difficult. Today we unravel the myth, the man, and machinery behind one of the most enigmatic regimes of the 20th century, North Korea. My guest is Fyodor Tertitskiy. Professor Tertitskiy is a prolific scholar, polyglot, and one of the few who reads the footnotes of history in multiple languages. His new book, Accidental Tyrant, a biography of Kim Il-sung, challenges the official state mythology and unearths the improbable rise of a guerrilla fighter turned dynastic dictator. So this is how Kim Il-sung outwitted imperialists, communists, comrades and colonels alike, turning chance into legacy, failure into foundation. But the question remains, what does this all mean for those of us living in a world still shaped by the ghosts of his decisions? Mr. Tertitskiy, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you for coming.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Let me start towards the end, as people like to do sometimes. In a world of nuclear brinkmanship, cyber warfare, Trump's tariffs, the situation in Palestine, Israel, Ukraine, all around the world, why should we still care about a man born in 1912? And what threads of Kim Il-sung's ideology do you see running through today, perhaps with his grandson? Why is Kim Il-sung still important?
Well, because he's pretty much the reason why we have North Korea as it is now. He is the reason why Kim Jong-un is in power. And lots of things which we know about the North have been shaped by him. And, well, in a matter of fact, his ideas still run the country. He's still venerated there basically as a living god. So, of course, he is supremely important for the understanding of modern North Korea. Like, take nuclear program. Well, it's his brainchild. He first got the idea that the country should have nuclear weapons during the Korean War. Remember, there was an episode when General MacArthur thought about using atomic weaponry against the North. It seems like that's what prompted that interest. From the 1970s, they started to develop these weapons actively, and although it's his son, Kim Jong-il, who turns North Korea into nuclear power, it all started under him. And perhaps 80% of everything about North Korea you see these days, it all started under him, and Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un largely still just continue what he formed. He is the grand architect of the North Korean state.
Can you say something about him being a god, please? In North Korean eyes, in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? Because he's seen as more than a mere mortal, isn't he?
Well, less so in the last few years, because it seems like the deification of the leader has annoyed Kim Jong-un. So in 2020s, this part of the cult has been substantially reduced. But before that, we used to publish legends on Kim Il-sung, saying people say he had an ability to teleport. So we didn't actively assert that, but sort of created a rumor about him having supernatural powers. And if you look at all films, and by all I mean basically everything which is before, say, 2017-ish, always Kim Il-sung has a presence there which no one can command in real life. When he comes into the room, basically everyone turns to him in absolute stunned awe and says, "Commander Kim Il-sung," as if some deity manifested itself on a corporeal plane.
And there would also be a presence of him in classrooms, the pins and badges and photos. Can you say something about that physical presence in the country, Fyodor?
Of course. Well, I mean, that's not divine because it's not supernatural, but on a normal level of cult of what we could imagine happening to any dictator, he's everywhere. His cult is basically the state ideology. It has been effectively replaced. So in each and every household, you must have his portrait. Each and every North Korean wears a badge with either him or his son or his grandson. His quote must be in every text. His sayings, if he utters something, it's immediately recorded and often put on a display. When he visits a place, we put a plaque commemorating the august visit of the great leader. Even the title itself is prescribed from above, so we tell people how exactly to venerate him. And there is something quite horrifying about the place where you are told how to exactly love the leadership, and you can't vacillate. So not even spontaneous declarations of love are permitted, like we will say under Mao and his Red Guards. No, that chaotic management of the populace has always been something very alien to Kim Il-sung.
What kind of names would they call him in Chosunmal, in North Korean? I'm sure some of them are very long and the titles are very esoteric, but would they call him, what would they call him?
Well, the absolute standard is Widean Surong, great leader. Others would be like Hyunmune Widean Surong, which was very popular in the 70s, the great leader of the revolution. Kyonen in Surong, respected and beloved leader, and many, many, many others. I think the loftiest one I called in my book, it was basically one paragraph, and that's what we call him when he died. I must confess I didn't memorize it. I had to look at the page and translate it bit by bit because it was so long. Like the title itself, it's more than your regular sentence.
This cult of personality, that's something that you address quite a lot in your book, that's been built up around him. Is it comparable to other leaders? Do we compare this cult of personality to, I don't know, Mao, to Idi Amin, to Che Guevara, or is it unique? How would you make a comparison?
Well, I would say it's probably not the most ridiculous one, because you could see some cults which go beyond, say Sapar Murad Niyazev in Turkmenistan, who were named months under his mother, or if I remember correctly, Idi Amin called himself the conqueror of the British Empire in general, and in Uganda in particular, and also the lord of all beasts and all fishes in the sea. And Emperor Nero, say, was officially proclaimed the victor in every single Olympic discipline. So you can find cults which are more ridiculous. But what makes this cult unique is it's so omnipresent. It's everywhere. Basically, this country, I would argue, it's not particularly communist or nationalist. I mean, there are elements of both you can find, but they both bow to the one overriding goal, worshipping a supreme leader, and now his son and grandson as well.
Is it possible for somebody raised in a democratic, say, Western industrialized society to understand the mindset of a North Korean purely because of that cult of personality, not because of any Orientalist mystique, but I'm just trying to imagine living like that, and things that come to my mind would be theocracies or living under a very religious, either extreme Christian or Muslim faith. Is that comparable? Can we come close to understanding how it must feel for a North Korean to exist in that cult of personality?
I think it's a bit different because if you look at most religions, if you live in a, say, fundamentalist Christian state, let's imagine such a state existing, from Handmaid's Tale. But the head of a state wouldn't be considered equal to Jesus, would he?
No.
Or even if you live into the most fundamentalist Islamic state, say ISIS, but still the caliph is no Muhammad. And the idea is that your divine figure is just there, next to you. It's not someone from the past or someone who washes you from the supernatural world and whom you can address in prayers. No, that's a man whom you can physically see and touch. And I think if you're looking for a comparison, perhaps pharaohs of ancient Egypt, who were also considered gods, maybe that would be something you should look at.
Let's be a little bit iconoclastic then, and let's break him down. Let's turn this Egyptian god into a small boy and put him into some context, because he wasn't called Kim Il-sung, and he had a very different life. In the beginning of your book, Fyodor, you say something very interesting about Japanese colonization of Korea, in that you do not describe it as one monolith experience, but rather you say that it changed according to the personalities of the generals, or the people in charge, I should say, of the Korean peninsula. Can you say something perhaps about that historical period in which Kim Il-sung, as he was later known, came into the world?
Yeah, well, yes, I do argue that personality and each and every governor generals are important, but that's just a general principle. Basically, head of state matters, and especially in authoritarian countries, and because the governor general has never been democratically elected, it's definitely an authoritarian regime, it matters even more. So Kim Il-sung was born in 1912, and the governor general at the time was called Terauchi Masatake. By the way, one remark I would like to make towards South of Korean historiography, they tend to totally ignore these foreign leaders of Korea instead of focusing on anti-colonial resistance, which I think is one of the best things which I could say about historical studies in this country. But I digress. So going back to Terauchi, he was the man, if I had to write a book about him, I would probably call it The Yellow Man's Burden, because he basically was a very old-school colonialist man who thought, well, I can't come to a place populated by savages. I'm a civilized man. It's my duty to bring them civilization. And with all pluses and minuses, it entitled. So on the positive side, you have like massive transformation of the Korean society. You have like the birth of modern education. You have development of hygiene, of healthcare, of infrastructure, of bureaucracy. Lots of like even forms of documents you can see in South Korea now can be traced back in Terauchi. On the negative side, of course, the Governor General feels of himself and his own, like fellow Japanese, as people who are definitely civilizationally superior to the Koreans, and therefore if the Koreans resist, it's because they're stupid savages who need to be put to a sword. And like it was like with your average colonial administration. So when people rebel, they are mercilessly cracked down upon. I think the only comparable figure I can think of, maybe it's just like my Russian origins talking to me, but I think Peter the Great in Russia was a bit similar in terms of these were really tectonic changes imposed from above by a man who was very, very sure of himself, who left a grand legacy, but probably was a bit too assured, a bit too self-centered, and way too cruel.
Your book is also published in Korean?
It is.
Yeah. Has there been any response or pushback on this? Because as you say, Korean history is a little bit different in that it doesn't generally focus on the personalities or the governor generals of Japan, and here you've just described some of the tectonic changes that took place and some of the advancements that took place, as well as highlighted the negative drawbacks. Has there been any response to that?
No, nothing negative. I'm not sure why, but it seems like basically people who read didn't have anything to object to my argument. Although, yes, I do find it very irritating when people ignore like super important people in the Japanese administration and think of like some minuscule facts about anti-colonial resistance. Like once I remember mocking this and saying, like, imagine studying Nazi Germany and not mentioning Adolf Hitler, but instead of that, describing in a great detail about White Rose meetings.
Yeah. And you continue that analysis, I noticed, when talking about Soviet ambassadors to the DPRK and their personalities and how they were not always the best bureaucrats, or it was a demoted position, and that personality does matter, I think.
Exactly. Well, when the person in charge, like I would say it's really important who Kistame is for the modern United Kingdom. Yeah. So it matters even in a democracy. In the authoritarian state, thousandfold so.
Yeah, we are not just empty black boxes. Also in the beginning of your book, you present, if I'm correct, you present Kim Il-sung as an outsider, perhaps shaped by his exposure to Western ideas in Manchuria, a pragmatic approach to survival. Can you say something about Kim Il-sung's early life, who he was as a young boy growing up before he became this Egyptian pharaoh?
Well, so he was originally he was called Kim Sonju, which is widely known, although most people, when they look at the characters, I think we quote the later version he only adopted in the 1920s, becoming the foundation. And his original name was Son, like the Holy Ones, and Chu Foundation, so Foundation of the Holy Ones. Christian name because he was from a Protestant family, so that was a quite well-to-do upper middle class family in Greater Pyongyang, so not inside the city, but from a village which was administratively attached to it. By the way, not Mangyeon there. That's where he spent his childhood. But evidently he wasn't born there. He was born in Chilgol, which is quite close to there. Then the biggest event in his early life is in 1990, 1st of March movement, Grand Anti-Colonial Uprising. His dad is an active participant, so that's not actually enough Korean propaganda records of the Japanese police on that. And then the second governor of in Korea, Hasegawa Yoshimichi, maybe not the most cruel, but definitely most incompetent, organizes a crackdown on the rebels. Kim Hyun-jik, that's Kim Il-sung's father, and his family, they flee to Manchuria. So they flee to a place called Badaogo, which is very close to Korea, but technically not a part of the Empire of Japan, so they can't be arrested. So at the time, as we know, China is very fractured, run by some warlords, and Manchuria is run by one of them. So it's basically a place where you can live, and if you pay taxes to the bandit in charge and do not make any fuss, you're most welcome. So we didn't have to do all the visa stuff like most people who are immigrants like yours truly know. Yeah, so they settle there, which means that from his early childhood, Kim Il-sung lives abroad. So he studies Chinese language. One of his stronger qualities was that he was very good when it came to foreign languages. He spoke near-native Chinese and later Russian. So he receives education from a place called Yuan Middle School. He probably had some primary education before that, but there are no known records, and you can't just trust North Koreans because they twist the narrative to their needs. So in Yuan Middle School, he was taught by a teacher called Shan Yue, who introduced him to a very crude and simplistic version of communist ideology, because Shan didn't have any books like by Marx, and only one translated book by Lenin, Imperialism as the high stage of capitalism. Ironically, Lenin mentioned Korea directly, saying that only then is like a Japanese communist an honest man if a Japanese communist supports a Korean independence. So from just as a spoiler ahead, Kim Il-sung never received a full Marxist-Leninist training, and always thought, well, he had a very simplistic understanding of what communism is about, basically a society of plenty, everything is provided by the state. But his ideology before his egotism eclipsed it was some simplistic nationalism, like Japs get out, with simplistic communism. Communism is good because it provides stuff.
If we stay on that idea of ideology a little bit, some people might not know about Christianity and Pyongyang and how prevalent it was, not in the Korean peninsula, but in that specific place, and also its influence on the March 1st movement. And now you talk about Kim Il-sung's father being in that religion, being a figure in that movement as well. Do you have anything to say about the influence of Christianity in Korea at that time, and to speculate whether it might have had any effect on him at any point?
Well, I don't go into that in great detail in the book because once again, I don't have any particular sources apart from some scars and North Korean in origin. Yeah, Christianity was, and when it comes to South Korea, still is very important here, both Catholic and Protestant. South Korea, from what I know, is the second most Christian country in Asia after the Philippines. And in the colonial period, the main city where most of the Christians lived was known as Haeju at the time, which is a colonial name for Pyongyang. So yeah, they even referred to it as Jerusalem of the East. It all ultimately people had to either run away during the division or in the Korean War, or they suffered when Kim Il-sung organized a massive crackdown on religion. In his official memoirs, he speaks of visiting the church as a kid, but never being quite impressed with Christianity, which is likely true, but once again, in the absence of additional testimonies, you can never trust him, because if anything, his memoirs with the century, they have been really refined and twisted by the North Korean propaganda.
What was his relationship like with his father? Do you know? Suddenly you write that in his later years he becomes quite nostalgic and talks of childhood. Do you know, or can you say anything about his relationship with his father?
Well, if anything, it seems like Kim Hyun-sik was the reason why he got his name, Kim Il-sung, because so Kim Son-jo, our main character, later adopts the name Kim Il-sung after another partisan commander. Several people holding that nom de guerre, and it seems Kim Hyun-sik was the one who talked to Yan Sonji about the very first one of them, the one who operated in the late 1900s. So yeah, problem is he dies quite early. So by North Korean records, he dies in the middle 1920s when Kim Il-sung is in his early teens. So they couldn't become quite close. And if anything, like maybe as an indicator that something was a bit wrong there. So there is a very interesting period in North Korean history, the early 1960s, when we already take enormous interest in the great leader, in Kim Il-sung. But before they settle up on a canon version in 1967. And in this publication, you can see a mention of some stuff which later gets completely erased. And one person who was there was called Kim Ryong-ho, who was an adopted child of Kim Hyun-sik and a completely unknown elder brother of Kim Il-sung. And because later, like in the 60s, it seems like Kim Ryong-ho still they could contact him, so he lived either in China or North Korea. But later he completely disappears. It seems like there was something wrong about that relationship. I'm not sure how it transcribes to his relationship with his father. I mean, ultimately Kim Hyun-sik became a deified figure as a man who was basically the leader of the entire anti-Japanese resistance, but he wasn't a leader, he was just a very active participant. I'd say he probably had an impact teaching his son the hatred of the colonial regime, and he also was responsible for providing him with good education. Let's not forget that at the time, even being literate was already an achievement. And Kim Il-sung, I mean, by modern standards, a middle school dropout is something like very, very low, but at standards it was quite okay. And even middle school in itself, where he started, was quite a prestigious place. Well, no Eton College, as I say in the book, but still quite a good school to go.
And you mentioned his language skills standing him in good stead for the rest of his life when interacting with people. Staying on that idea of ideology, we did Christianity. Can you say something about communism, particularly as it was understood then, and in that particular context, not just with Kim Il-sung himself, but it had a great impact on the Korean peninsula. You suggest that Soviet people suggest themselves to be, definitively on the side of righteousness by liberating colonized people, bringing progressive social conditions. Communism obviously is a very loaded word today, especially in South Korea and parts of the West. What is communism? How was it understood in the 1920s, 30s and 40s as all of this was happening? What did people think communism was?
Well, ultimately, if you look at the roots of socialist ideology, you have two schools of thought there. First is that the masses are great, and what we need to do is to uplift them and give them means to govern themselves. And that's probably where your social democracy originated. Second school of thought, which you can find as early as in ancient Greece, is that masses are stupid and we need one god of people, usually the author would say like myself, to lead them because I know the truth. And that prideful school of thought is where communism ultimately originated. So the idea was that there is a group of really great and enlightened people, the Communist Party, who know what's best for the society because we understand the scientific laws of history as discovered by Karl Marx, and they can lead the working people to glory. And if the working people object, it's because they're either stupid and they should be enlightened, or because they have the enemy of the true cause and they must be eliminated as such. So that was the ideology. Ultimately, the idea as envisioned by Marx was that through these means of violent revolution, the society would be completely transformed into a classless utopia. Later, I think the first time that term originated, they thought there would be a short transitional period called socialism. Initially, I think Marx, as I remember, envisioned it as sort of 6 months, and it became longer and longer. And ultimately, no country has ever proclaimed they achieved that future communist utopia. To a certain extent, in some works of Kim Il-sung, you can see an impact of that, because sometimes he mentioned there are 2 stages of socialism and the next one is going to be greater. But ultimately, it doesn't seem that he truly believed in the future, because the whole communist project is about building a communist society. And even when it itself disappears by the end of Kim Il-sung's rule, I mean, now they keep it as a sort of token symbol of respect towards China and its Communist Party and other self-declared communist nations. But what they assert, unlike, say, the Soviet Union or the Eastern Europe, they do not assert that there would be a future where all classes will disappear, that humanity will be one happy family, and sort of hinting that even the party will no longer be necessary. Because in Soviet Union you could write something like in the future when communist triumphs, Communist Party self-dissolves because it's no longer necessary. No. In North Korea the idea is that the current social order is perfect and it will be preserved for eternity.
It sounds like a very fervent time for ideology, with communism, democracy, Christianity whirling around on the Korean peninsula as people looked, and we still sort of see it as, some people would see it as, an ideological divide that puts it. Do you attribute a lot of importance and influence to ideological divide on the Korean peninsula?
Well, I think that your question itself is a bit influenced by South Korean historiography, because ideological divide wouldn't be between the democratic and communist and nationalist opposition. Ideological divide would be in between of hardcore loyalists to Japan, silent majority, and the opposition. That would be it. And when we go inside the opposition, you would find all these schools of thought. But remember, at the time, the most important question would be, are you the loyal subject of His Majesty the Emperor or not?
And Kim Il-sung wasn't. He?
No, he totally wasn't. He was a very disloyal subject of His Majesty the Emperor.
Yeah. Can you say something about that? Because there is some debate about whether he was engaged in guerrilla fighting in the hills of Manchuria, or whether that's all a legend. What do you know about his anti-Japanese policies?
Well, I would say if you look for something controversial, I can go with his brother was actually an interpreter in Japanese army, if you would like to find some loyalists trace in the family. But Kim Il-sung himself never was. So what happens in the 1920s, he is in middle school when he is arrested by local authorities for some political activities, seemingly harmless, and after a few months in prison he gets released. It's all in his file, which my dad and I found in Russian archives, file of his interrogation protocol when he was detained by the Soviets in 1941, so long before he becomes a great leader and therefore very authentic. In the late 1920s he spends in some immigrant organizations, usually which have very lofty name and are completely useless and have absolutely no hope of influence in anything, and then everything changes because the Japanese army conquers Manchuria, and very soon we proclaim the puppet state of Manchukuo. So it was then when Kim Il-sung joins the armed resistance. There are multiple records on him and multiple testimonies, so it's definitely not a legend. He was there. And it seems like the fake date of the creation of the so-called Korean People's Revolutionary Army, that's a false attributed to him by North Korean propaganda, 25th of April 1932. It's actually like the date when he became partisan, when he joined the armed resistance under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, of which he himself was a member. He even disclosed who recommended him, a man named Lee Chun-san, who was Ri Chon-san in North Korean spelling, who is mentioned twice with a century, of course, with no mention of the Communist Party. It's actually like a very funny story, because when we talk about resistance years of Kim Il-sung, we often mention party organizations, which is an enormous self-contradiction, because by North Korean narrative, party originates in 1945, so a logical question, what party are we talking about in the 30s? Well, the correct answer is the Communist Party of China, but you can't say that.
Two questions in my mind, Fyodor. The first one is, was he a soldier? Did he fight? Did he shoot guns? Did he kill people?
Yes.
The second one was, does this anti-Japanese action, does it endear him to the Korean left? Does it give some sort of support? Because there is a battle sort of in parts of Korea, what was happening, and the collaboration issue always comes up. Here was a man that was very anti-colonial. So is there an element or an idea that does make him almost a Korean hero?
Well, of course, I mean, some people do consider any resistance to the Japanese rule to be an act of heroism. And of course, from that point of view, it makes him a hero. I just would like to add that he definitely wanted to destroy the Japanese regime, which, well, at least from 1936, was very cruel and inhumane. But the problem is with what?
Yeah.
And you can argue that what he built was even worse.
We will come to what he built, and I agree with your conclusion there, Fyodor. His relationship with Russia and China, because he doesn't just stay in Manchuria, he then moves about. And can you say something about how this works?
Yeah, first I would like to make a small correction, not with Russia, but with the Soviet Union. And why is that important?
Yeah.
Not just because of the name,
Yeah.
but because the Soviet Union is so much bigger. And there are lots of people who are not from Russia. Say Ambassador Shtikov, who was...
Belarusian.
Yes, he is Belarusian.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there are quite a few people from Central Asia in North Korean elite. So it's not just like the name that matters, but really because it was such a big country. Yeah, so Kim Il-sung has to flee Manchuria in 1940 because the only other alternatives are either surrender or getting killed. Because after the full-scale invasion to the mainland China begins in 1937, Japan does its best to scour every trace of resistance in the client state. Largely succeeds. Most of Kim Il-sung's comrades are either killed or they surrender or captured, like his first wife, Han Sung-hee. By the way, Kim Jong-suk, like mother of Kim Jong-il, wasn't his first wife, it was his second wife. To a large extent, a replacement of his first wife because we look so similar. Yeah, but he and his pregnant second wife, Kim Jong-suk, they escaped to the Soviet Union when they were interrogated by Comintern officials and ultimately settled in a partisan camp. And later, he, in a completely unprecedented gesture, becomes a Soviet officer, because never before and never after have foreigners, like people without Soviet nationality, have been accepted to the Soviet army.
What was the reason that they were accepted? Was it just necessity?
Yeah, it was an act of desperation. So in June 1941, USSR is invaded by Nazi Germany. And Hitler is very clear about what he wants to do. He wants to conquer the European part, enslave the population, and slaughter everyone, not just like in first, like Jews and Communists, but perhaps many more. Like it was really a very cruel war with hunger plan designed by SS to starve the Slavs and lots of other atrocities we know. So for the Soviet people, it becomes a war of survival, which means like everyone who's in Far East is is mobilized, and the headquarters in Moscow, they constantly send to the Far Eastern Front Command, requests more manpower for the front, and they send division after division. But local commander General Apanasenko, he is a very shrewd and smart man, and he understands that we can't just send everyone, because what will happen if we need men to fight Japan? So he instructs his subordinates to mobilize everyone, and after they even start emptying concentration camps by overriding the Gulag authorities and granting amnesty, we finally come up with the idea of creating a brigade with foreigners, with the partisans, because by that time Apanassin had dropped his rule division for a division, and for each division departed he wanted at least a brigade. And that's how the unique unit in which Kim Il-sung served, the 88th Separate Infantry Brigade, was born. Kim Il-sung was a battalion commander, so he was directly commissioned as captain. He has never been a lieutenant. So he was there as a battalion commander, and that was his only rank in the Soviet army.
There's a photo of that, I believe, in your book, isn't there? Of the
yes,
in his uniform. People today might see relations between North Korea and Russia, and they might be a little bit confused as to why they seem so close, because at least from an outside perspective, people that aren't sort of Korean studies experts, or they might see Europe and Asia, they might see sort of two culturally, geographically very different people coming together. They might think of George W. Bush and his terminologies of axes and things like this. But the Soviet Union and North Korea had very close relationship, even to the foundation. Can you help us please understand that relationship and then Kim Il-sung's role in it? But the Soviet Union, North Korea, the foundation of North Korea, Kim Il-sung.
Well, I mean, think of a father and a son. That would be the closest relations, like the many families who remain very close, and some they aren't. So North Korea was a state created by the USSR, and it was its offspring. So it was established as a place totally controlled by the Soviet Union to a comical degree. So all the early laws were originally written in Russian and then translated to Korean. Sometimes you can see that it's really bad Korean. Like my favorite example is a greeting from 55 regulations, military regulations, is "Donde del Konga Hashimika," really, comrades, are you healthy? Which is a very illiterate and stupid translation of "Здравствуйте, товарищи," the formal greeting in the Soviet army. You can even see, like, on some documents, where regulations of the KPA, Korean People's Army, are already completed, and they are also translated into Korean in the Soviet reports. So that arrangement lasts until the beginning of the Korean War, but even during these first years, you can see that Kim Il-sung is constantly pushing for more autonomy, and he is granted that autonomy during the war because Stalin remembers the war with Germany, when he understood that he needs to trust his generals, and now Kim Il-sung is one of his generals. After death of Stalin, Kim Il-sung survives de-Stalinization. Largely this process is completed by late 1957. Then he rules as completely unchallenged autocrat until his death in 1994.
The Soviet Union essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, Fyodor, choose Kim Il-sung to be the first leader. They choose Pyongyang as the capital. It's not just translations of laws, but they essentially create it. First, I'm jumping back a lot. Did you say you went to the archives with your father to find something?
Well, my dad is a sinologist, so he is currently researching in the University of Tel Aviv in Israel. Yes, that was the document which I found its existence, and my dad was the one who physically copied it from the Russian Archive of Socio-Political History, which is like older party documents, and the co-authored an article about it. It was published in Acta Koreana and very much available online. If any of our listeners are interested, just go on my ResearchGate pages. It's very much there.
Yeah. That must be amazing that you get to do such work with your father. I'm sure he must be very proud of the work that you're doing as well. Can you tell us something about Joseph Stalin? Certainly growing up in Western Europe, we don't learn much about Stalin. He's a caricature almost. Certainly not the Uncle Joe of early days, but rather he's a figure that's lampooned almost. Can you say something about Stalin, who he was, or what Stalinism means, his role in all of this story that's coming?
Well, I mean, it's not exactly my specialty, Stalin's biography, but okay. So, born Josip Benjugashvili, he is an ethnic Georgian, Georgia the country, not Georgia the American state. So he becomes a member of Communist Party, but before that he has a very different career, from a bank robber to at a certain point he wanted to become a priest and started in a seminary. I think that's where he got his style of writing, because Joseph Stalin liked asking rhetorical questions, and his writing was very clear. He's much easier to read than, say, Marx or Lenin. So he is usually not viewed as a second of command under Vladimir Lenin. That role goes to Lev Trotsky, but Stalin very cleverly manipulates his opponents against each other in the inter-party struggle, because Lenin didn't leave a successor in 24. By 1929, he is usually accepted here when he emerges in the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union, and it seems like he really runs the Soviet Union as you could expect from, I don't know, mafia boss perhaps, because he is very, very paranoid on one hand, and the second, he is quite a cynical man. I think like one of my favorite stories, so Marshal Kirill Meretskov, who is a bit important to our story because he was one overseeing the Soviet administration, not on the ground but from Vladivostok. So he was purged just before the war with Germany, and Meretskov was about to be killed because he was named a fascist spy. So instead of doing the usual, I screaming to investigator, no, I'm innocent, long live Comrade Stalin. So after the war began in June 41, he wrote an extremely cynical letter to Joseph Stalin saying, Comrade Supreme Commander, this is Kirill Meretskov writing to you, so you need people like me to lead in this war. Please release me and send me to the front lines. Stalin looked at it and said, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Have that guy released and send him to the front lines. Usually it was very soft-spoken man and a sort of menacing intonation like that. And Meretskov was there, but of course he was released from prison and he was reinstated, and his alleged participation in the fascist conspiracy has been totally forgotten, which by the way shows that Stalin didn't really believe most of the accusations. He understood that he is sentencing very innocent people to death, and he thought it was necessary for his greater vision. I'd say Kim Il-sung and his purges, I think, shared very same mentality. I don't think he actually believed any of the people he purged were spies. So Kim Il-sung and Stalin meet for the first time in 46, but the appointment itself occurs in 45. Actually, so I have quite a long story in the whole chapter 4 is dedicated for that. There is no document discovered which directly says appoint Kim Il-sung as a leader, but you can pretty much pinpoint that, and it seems like the date is 17th of December 45. The information I'm given now, by the way, is partially based on research I did after the book, so it's a bit more precise. So ultimately it seems, you can read a story, but ultimately it says that the man who recommended Kim Il-sung is Lavrentiy Beria. So that was testified by General Lebedev, one of the top 3 generals in the Soviet administration. But there is a wonderful book published in Moscow in 2008, which is a record of all people who visited Stalin's workroom, a place where he was running the country from, because when you open the door and come in, your guards will make a remark like who came in and who came out. And before that day, before 17th of December, Stalin is on vacation, and he only comes to the Kremlin on that day. And the final line on that is Comrade Beria. He was a final visitor on that day, and the next day Kim Il-sung is appointed chief secretary. So it's quite likely, I'd say it's of course a conjecture, but it seems like on that time one of the topics Beria rose up with Stalin was a potential leader for North Korea. Maybe there is a document somewhere in the chaotic mess, which is the archive of Russian Defense Ministry. It's really not a pleasant place to be around in Podolsk. But, and maybe at a certain point in the future we would discover it. But in any case, it seems they know of it, and they know the guy who recommended him.
Why do you think he was recommended? What do you think that Soviet leaders or generals Beria and such forth, what did they see in Kim Il-sung?
Well, that's Marshal Beria. That's not General
I beg your
Beria.
pardon. Yeah, I get countries and army ranks and everything else wrong. I'll make more mistakes, Fyodor.
Oh, that's okay. It's just like it's a high rank. That's why I'm joking. Yes. So the thing is, like, originally there was a list of candidates, also disclosed in a very obscure document in one conference materials by an eccentric guy called Gavril Kharkov. Yeah, a list of candidates sent to Kremlin. But the thing is, like, Kremlin wanted a candidate who fit certain criteria, and none of these, like over a dozen people, fit the criteria. It seems that Beria, he saw a list and he instructed his own man. Well, you see, there are lots of imperfect people here. Find me the one who is better. And Kim Il-sung, by the time, was recommended by, noted by his superiors because this man was charismatic, he was loved by his unity, and very importantly, he spoke very fluent Russian, and they could communicate. And also, there was one more person, his personal secretary, Mun Il, who was actively and aggressively lobbying for him, and he was a Soviet Korean, so his Russian was native. And so, someone evidently reported that to Beria by his own channels, after which Beria proudly came to the Generalissimo, Stalin, and Beria looked at at Stalin and says, well, Comrade Stalin, you see, that's the list, that's the criteria you suggested, and they are not quite good, so I found a better candidate. And so the story goes, Stalin says, well, good job, Lavrenti, and recommended Kim Il-sung to be the leader. It was initially a very provisional appointment. Kim Il-sung was only finalized, his appointment was finalized in 1949 when he was formally put in charge of the Unified Workers' Party of Korea. But if anything, this man has always been very, very good in manipulating his superiors. I think that's one of the lessons he learned in anti-Japanese resistance movement, because the movement was also prone to purges. Like there was an incident called about the group of People's Welfare, like the alleged pro-Japanese organization, which partisans fought, infiltrated the resistance. Kim Il-sung was even forced to falsely confess his membership in that, but he survived then. So he survived through a lot of natural selection, because everyone who wasn't as shrewd or as good and understanding and predicting the actions of the others was killed at the time. So yes, he survived for all this process, and he was, by a twist of fate, chosen in 1945. It's quite an illogical selection, because if I would be sitting there, say, in July 45 or like in August 45 and thinking who would be the leader, would probably pinpoint Park Hanyang, the leader of the Communist Party of Korea. Isn't it very logical? Like say, like Clement Gottwald becomes the leader of communists in Czechoslovakia because he already is. But no, because Park was in Seoul and it was in the American occupation zone, and by the time he established contact with the Soviets, the list was already gone, this decision was made. So it's very important to be in the right time, in the right place, because window of opportunity is so small and it can be shut down forever. A lesson to all of us.
And that window of opportunity has led, and it's still here, we still have the North Korea. So he comes into Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung, he's the chosen leader, and you write about him having to almost sort of relearn Korean or to be recognized by the local domestic population, because he's coming from the outside, very much like Lee Seung-man coming into the South from the outside. He's been based in America. Can you say something based on your understanding of the Soviet people on the ground and the records of what those early first days of North Korea were like? Because then there still would have been the Taegukgi as we know it today, I think, and there would have been pictures of Stalin rather than just Kim Il-sung. can you say something about the very early days of North Korea, perhaps from 48 to 50 before the war starts?
Yeah, well, the flag, the modern flag of South Korea, Taekki, the flag of great extremes, was used in the north until July 1948, when we adopted a new one. The new flag was actually designed in the Soviet Union. It's all in the book. So Kim Il-sung takes a ship named Yemelyan Pugachev, originally manufactured in the United States and granted to the Soviet Union as a loyal ally in the World War II. So he arrives to Wonsan, where he is greeted by Colonel Kuchumov, who is a local commandant. When I think he took a train. Yes, he took a train to Pyongyang, and initially it's just, well, I came home, maybe I should start some business or do become a trader or something. But then his friend and later personal secretary, who I think is the most ignored and extremely devious person in North Korean history, Mun Il. In one of my other books, like War to the Vanquished, I call him North Korean Moriarty, and there is a chapter dedicated to him. So he just takes Kim Il-sung and introduces him to Soviet generals, starting with General Lebedev, and General Lebedev says, oh, well, I mean, let's be more active. And that's when we start communicating. He's appointed first as a deputy commandant of Pyongyang, which I think means not just the city, but like the entire province of South Pyongyang. And then the Soviets took a liking to him when we realized that he is an ideal candidate in their view for future leader. They already start lobbying for him. So his first public appearance on 40th of October 1945 is before Stalin makes his decision. It's a demonstration in honor of the Red Army, not in honor of Kim Il-sung. He makes a surprise appearance very, very well staged, because he was basically hidden, and he had to claim to the stage and make his first very small speech about glorious generalissimo Stalin and the Red Army, and only in December does it all get approved by Joseph Stalin. Yeah, so you see at an early stage he is just happy to be home. He has no plans on becoming the leader, but once he gets a taste of power, you really can feel it, even the physical transformation, because you can see also Kim Il-sung is pretty thin in the 1950s and in 1945. By 1946 he is already quite chubby, which I think is partially should be credited to his Japanese servant Hagio Kazuko, what's her name, the refugee from Manchukuo girl who cooked for him. And Kim Il-sung starts living like a boss in a luxury building in central Pyongyang.
And he retained that opulence for quite a while, didn't he?
Yes.
Going towards the Korean War, Yu-Gi-Oh, Andrew Salmon, the historian, told me that Kim Il-sung and his people took invasion plans to the Soviet Union, maybe to Stalin.
What invasion plans to the Soviet Union?
Well, this is why I'm asking you this question. That they took plans, or they took a demand to invade, and the Soviets saw the plans and said, that's not how you do it, that won't work. And they sort of said, this is how you do it. How did the war start, Fyodor?
Okay. Well, sorry, I completely misunderstood. I thought North Korea invading the Soviet Union.
No. Sorry, they the story from Andrew Salmon, and I'm going from memory, so do forgive me. I'll go back and check our conversation. That Kim Il-sung and his leaders, they wanted to invade the South, and so they presented the Soviet Union with plans to invade the South. The Soviet Union looked at them and said, "That's not going to work, and this is how you do it."
Well, not exactly, but close enough. So the first time Kim Il-sung starts lobbying for the invasion of South Korea comes after he completely secures his power and becomes a party leader in 1949, virtually in a month. There are two lobbyists and two chief architects of the Korean War. It's him and Park Kon-yeon, the leader of the South Korean communists. They're both very, very active in pushing for that. So initially, they managed to convince the Soviet embassy, Ambassador Shtikov, and his second-in-command counselor, Tunkin, and they relay their plans to Moscow. Stalin's initial reaction is meet Comrade Kim Il-sung and tell him in absolutely no uncertain words, no, 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 you don't do that. You mentioned the local operation to conquer Onjin Peninsula. No, this is not permissible. You will not start the Third World War. Then something changes because Kim Il-sung lobbies for that again on the 17th of January 1950, and on the 30th of January he receives a yes from Stalin. So it seems what happened was China, because China very quickly fell to the communists, like the mainland was conquered by Mao Zedong and his People's Liberation Army, and as you can see just before, Stalin replies with a yes to a second request. He's meeting with Mao. At the time, Mao is in Moscow. And once the invasion is authorized, it changes everything. Soviet advisors arrive to Pyongyang. They start to craft the invasion plan. It seems like at the very last moment, it seems like just Kim Il-sung came with the idea to frame it as a South Korean invasion, which was immediately thwarted by the North. But in any case, the date of the war is set to Sunday, 25th of June, and in the night, North Korea attacks the South, starting the most devastating war in Korean history. There are lots of anecdotes you can see about that. My favorite is that President Lee, Sinman Rhee, was completely not prepared for that, because he wasn't even in his palace. He was not in presidential palace. He was enjoying his free time.
He was fishing, wasn't he?
He was fishing and thinking about state affairs, correct? Yes. And it took a few hours for the army to even reach the president and inform the commander-in-chief that we have just been invaded by North Koreans.
Was it also intentionally done on Sunday because people might have been at church?
Yes, of course. I mean, if you look at North Korea likes to amplify it when we speak of sneaky Americans instructing the South Korean army to invade South, but it was actually just a North Korean logic they used for invasion. It's all very well documented. There are plenty of documents and testimonies on each and every side. Actually, like the more honest North Koreans realized what happened. There are testimonies of one of the most interesting people whom I've read, like Lieutenant General Kan Sang-ho from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the time, he was a deputy party chief of Gangwon province, and he said, we were all summoned on an emergency meeting on the night, and Kim Il-sung told them they've just been invaded by South Korea. I've ordered a counterattack. So you see, even like that, high-ranking cadres were fed nonsense. It seems like the inner circle of Kim Il-sung who knew the truth were like 6 people. Something. But then Kan Sang-ho on the 26th of June, so 2 days after the invasion, he travels to South Korea, and he says it's amazing because I come to the 30th parallel and there is absolutely no destruction on our side, but on the opposite side there are massive signs of war. There are corpses of people, there are abundant guns, and then I realized we were not attacked, we started this war.
How close did North Korea come to winning the war?
Here also I can say something which is a bit new, because the common answer to that is we came very close, because we, at a certain point, we controlled virtually 90% of Korean peninsula, so you'd assume they expected a swift victory. No. So actually, if you look at the documents, because at the time they were still very much under Soviet control and they had to interact with the Soviets every day, and in the Soviet documents it's all very transcribed. Even at the late June, or definitely early July, so roughly 1 week on it starts, the mood in Pyongyang is not euphoria of the advanced army, but a sense of impending doom, because something happened which we could not predict. Americans intervened immediately. They didn't expect it. Thought South Korea would fall and the Yankees would stay in Japan. But a counterattack was immediately authorized. The US Air Force started bombing Pyongyang. So the general mood in the political council, that's how Politburo was called at the time, was what the devil is going on. Why, if the Americans are here, the Soviets and the Chinese do not come to our help, something will happen. Supreme Commander, Kim Il-sung became the Supreme Commander in July. Supreme Commander, what is going on? Maybe we should ask for help already, because it seems like something will happen and the Americans will come here in force. And as you know, they did in July in operation.
Can you say something about Mun Il, Fyodor? This Moriarty type figure, and I see your eyes light up as soon as I mention him, but...
Yes, so I must say he is the most enigmatic, most devious, and the strangest figure in of Korean history. So when I even will make a personal confession, when I was writing a chapter for him for my another book, which I mentioned, More to Vanquished, one of the thoughts I caught myself, I was very thankful he was dead, because he was a man who manipulated everyone and who remained in the shadows. So I thought if he would have been alive, I would be slightly afraid to write something about him. So that was a man who was responsible for so many things in North Korean history, and only when you pitch like random testimonies together, you understand what a colossus he was. So he was initially they meet in the 88th Brigade, and it seems like at a very early stage when Soviets think that might be a war in Japan and perhaps will conquer Korea, and who would be their leader, which we should appoint, when it's all in super preliminary stage. At that point, Mun Il is the one who mentions Captain Kim, who is serving there under Khabarovsk. So next, Mun Il is the one who takes Kim Il-sung and introduces him to the Soviet generals. Mun Il is also responsible largely for the name Democratic People's Republic of Korea, because at the time there were two conflicting schools of thoughts. Perhaps funnily enough, so Park Hanyang, leader of South Korean communists, was pushed for Korean People's Republic. That was a very short-living regime which existed in August 45 before the Americans arrived, and he wants that spiritual continuation. Another group led by Kim Il-sung, who was affiliated with Chairman Mao, thought that it should be Korean Democratic Republic, because Mao was obsessed with the word in his idea of new democracy, which is an improved democracy, not like the one we have in the West. So at the same time, the decision maker, Soviet generals say, well, you are not like a people's country, which is like an early stage, you are not already a democratic country like the Soviet Union. Like maybe we should call your country Korean People's Democratic Republic, Корейская Народно-Демократическая Республика. Yes, so what Kim Il-sung did, he created a name which sounded like that, but the official translation to Russian was exactly what General Lebedev said, because the order is different in Korean. 조선 민주주의 인민공화국, Korean Democratic People's Republic. So you see, not even like in English. And in doing that, he looked like a guy who came up with a compromise. He looked like a guy who took general's instruction to the heart. And why could Kim Il-sung do it? Because Mun Il told him about everything, about each and every debate, and about a command of General Lebedev. Then comes another episode when Kim Il-sung, it's during the Korean War, it's October 1950, then North Korea is already in full retreat, about to abandon Pyongyang. You know that Americans and the Allies crossed the 38th parallel, and the only hope is China. And Mao Zedong's initial reaction is, no, we just won war in our country, it's devastated, we don't want to risk a full-scale war with Americans. If we save few divisions, it probably won't be enough, so maybe it would be good for the Korean comrades to suffer temporary defeat. Kim Il-sung is completely broken. He fantasizes about setting up maybe guerrilla units, or training some pilots and coming with Air Force from USSR, and the man whom he confesses about what is going on is Mun Il. That's the level how he trusts. Finally, Mun Il is might be some more episodes I fail to remember now. I just send everyone who's interested to the other book of mine. So Mun Il is also very smart because he's the first to leave. So when the situation starts to change, long before any of his comrades realizes that Kim Il-sung is about to start purging Soviet Koreans, in 1951 Mun Il leaves the country. And then he lives there in total seclusion in Soviet Union, working in some conscription station as a sort of like middle-level military clerk, never talks to anyone, completely refuses interview and socialization, peacefully passes away. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I forgot another one. One more episode. Sorry, Mun Il is also a person who was so after he visited Soviet deputy ambassador, well, de facto deputy ambassador, Councillor Tunkin. It was the first time the Soviets started to consider potential invasion to South Korea. So you see, I forgot probably the most important episode after the leadership appointment, his involvement in the Korean War. So lots and lots of small episodes which ultimately had a magnificent impact on North Korean industry had hit his footprint. I have no idea why he did it. He really feels like Professor Moriarty sitting there and pulling the strings, and since there was no Sherlock Holmes to uncover him, he died an absolute enigma.
And that's probably a good death for that time, to have lived a peaceful life in seclusion and not to be erased. Is he in this photo?
I'm not sure if he is. He definitely is in another book, but no, not on that photo you're showing me. You're showing me a very famous photo of 1953 of the Kim Il-sung's brigade. He's not there. I'll have a brief look through the book. Maybe he'll be somewhere else. Yes, he actually is. That's him. That's Mun Il, the man standing. So in the book it's picture 6, and Kim Il-sung is lying there on the ground. In the back you can see a man in civilian suit next to a tree, and that's Mun Il.
He looks like a Moriarty in that photo as well, doesn't he?
He does.
Absolutely fascinating. You've mentioned Chairman Mao now a couple of times, obviously victorious in the Chinese Civil War. His son dies in the Korean War, and I've heard that, elements of China hold North Korea responsible for that, for starting a war and not being able to finish it. Can you say something about Mao? I know perhaps you're not ready to do a Mao biography, but there will be people that put sort of Kim Il-sung, Stalin, Mao in the same paradigm or frame in their head when they're very different people. And where does Chairman Mao fit into Kim Il-sung's story, Fyodor?
Well, Chairman Mao was the one who saved him from defeat in 1950, so you can argue Kim Il-sung was brought to power twice, and both times by foreigners, first by Stalin and then by Mao. In terms of governance, we were quite different people, because Mao loved controlled chaos. He loved the angry mob doing things for him, like the Red Guards movement and the whole Cultural Revolution, which Kim Il-sung, the man of ultimate order, was completely appalled with. I could even, it would be maybe a bit childish comparison, but maybe you have heard about the concept of Dungeons and Dragons alignment of characters, like lawful versus chaotic and good versus evil. This is very much your lawful evil versus chaotic evil, where Chairman Mao is definitely the chaotic one and Kim Il-sung is very much lawful. There is some Maoist influence in North Korea in some slogans like self-reliance, terror campaign, or like the paramilitaries, unlike the regular armed forces, are modeled after China, because the armed forces are ridiculously similar to the Soviet army, even up to the uniform. But ultimately, they are significantly different in the way they envisioned the country and in the way their legacy ended, because, as we know, Mao's legacy was quickly shelved by a successor, and Deng Xiaoping's China was nothing like that under Mao, and Kim Il-sung did his very best to avoid this fate. In one of the documents I saw, Kim even explicitly mentioned it, that Mao died, but he didn't leave a successor. Well, I did.
Eventually, Kim Il-sung removes, we're going after the war here, but he removes Soviet and Chinese influence, not just influence, maybe I'm expressing this wrong, but Soviet Koreans, Chinese Koreans, factions inside North Korea which existed. Eventually, Kim Il-sung starts to kind of purge these out, doesn't he, and create control. Can you say about how that takes place? Because you've expressed already how Kim Il-sung was saved twice or brought to power twice, but eventually he removes all of those influences from North Korea.
Correct. So, first of all, like the word faction here, I think it's the problem. It's translated from Korean originally, so it's Sorenpa or Yonanpa, like one of the oldest concepts in North Korean studies, which originate in the early 1960s South Korea. And Pa literally means faction, but it's more like a group, because faction in English implies a great degree of ideological cohesion. And in each of every of them, you can see like people who are pretty moderate and people who are very hardline. Like in Chinese so-called faction, I would say one guy, Sohui, who was so heterodox you can't even probably call him a communist. He was more like a very liberal syndicalist, very unusual person in North Korean history. Yes, but Kim Il-sung is very persistently consolidates his power. It all starts probably with Stalin's death in March 1953. One of the first people to be removed would be Park Hun-yeon, who a leader of the what we call domestic faction, I would say domestic group, probably like the leader of the communists who were struggling against Japan on colonial era and was not protected by any of the communist great powers. So these are first of all. Then something happens to the leader of the Soviet Koreans, Alexei Hagai, or Hogai in Korean. It seems that more likely he commits suicide, but very, very persistent rumors that he was actually killed by Kim Il-sung. I'm more inclined to the suicide version, but who knows. Then he moves against the Chinese Koreans and they arrest the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Chief of Police, Park Il, and ultimately it all comes to a grand showdown on the August plenum. There is a book by Andrei Lankov about that. He also wrote a big chapter about the plenum itself in my another book, Soviet-North Korean Relations during the Cold War. And from what I know, Anpe is currently working on the much bigger version of it in Korea. Yeah, but that is one of the key events on North Korean history on 30th of August 1956, where emboldened by destabilization in the Soviet Union, the opposition tries to attack Kim Il-sung and immediately fails. Actually, like if you look at something comparable, I would point at the country I don't think many people would think of, Albania. Because Albania had incident like this in April 1956 when it also had a party conference, and the liberal wing of the Albanian Labour Party tried to remove their dictator and the Hoxha from power, and they also failed, and it also had quite catastrophic consequences for the country.
Then there is a speech that Kim Il-sung gives that you've called one of the most transformative speeches, where he sort of institutionalizes, and please correct me on this, a form of sort of totalitarian Stalinist control over the population.
Oh, you mean May 25th instructions? Yes, the instructions of 25 May, Oyo Kyoshi. So that happens later. That happens a bit later. That happens in 1967, although Kim Il-sung himself would have agreed with you, because he said, like, everything which happens now have transpired because of 1956. He says that, sort of like display of honesty, perhaps. The thing is, we know very little about the speech because it has never been released. I can even disclose that I once talked to a person who was working in South Korean counterintelligence in the 1980s. I asked him about this speech. So he smiled because we talked like roughly 30 years after it happened, and he found it very cute of me asking about ancient times. He said, like in the 80s, our superiors understood what important speech it is, so they started asking around in the military intelligence and the civilian and everywhere, do we have it? We do not. Like, it's not even in our restricted archives. Like, don't look for it. There is none. So the only thing which was disclosed was the name on the necessary directions in party propaganda work. Well, that sounds extremely dull and boring. But the speech was a very ominous, and it created a thing called Sasancheki in Korean, which is traditionally translated as monolithic ideological system, and I prefer, I would argue that's a more correct translation, singular thought system. Because Sasan is not just ideology, it's like the pattern of thinking.
Yeah.
Thought like thought police of George Orwell, that kind of thought. So these, you said Stalinist. I would say no, Joseph Stalin was a liberal compared to that. If it wasn't the Stalinization, it was a very opposite direction. So well, a totalitarian state is, you can argue it's different from authoritarian, because authoritarian states are very content with you being silent, and just like if you never question the regime openly, well, just sit out there, citizen. No, totalitarian state wants your active participation. Neutrality is not permitted. So it was from then, and North Korea started to teach Kim Il-sung's life in schools as a separate subject. It was when then Kim Il-sung's portrait became mandatory for being put in every single household. Then his name started to be written in bold. I mean, they had publications like that, but ultimately that became a doctrine after this speech, and also some other elements of North Korean totalitarianism, like permits to travel inside the country, like complete and total ban on foreign radio and foreign publications, not just capitalists but also fellow communists, all happened then in 1967.
And that's kind of what the North Korea we know today, isn't it? That sort of totalitarian active participation, it comes from that.
Correct. I mean, there have been some changes, but I'd say you can very easily summarize it. The economy is much more marketized, and also Kim Jong-un abandoned the idea of unification. With these two changes in mind, it's very much the state created then in the dark days of May of 67.
He's a very lucky leader. He's excellent in his languages, as you've said. He's been in the right place when these small windows open. He has a certain cunning, maybe with the help of Mun Il, to persuade those above him and to survive various purges. But North Korea, what do you make of him economically? It feels like there's a lot of sort of, you say that he comes dedicated to these on-the-spot guidance, and when he does that, people all of a sudden, present him with a fake view of things, and that he might be charismatic, he might have language skills, but he's lacking in other areas as he tries to develop his country.
Yeah, I would say economically he's an incompetent fool. And I have a proof. Look around you, South Korea. So the country which had a potential to be like the South became the poorest nation in East Asia. It still has enormous potential, because if you look at the countries with a similar GDP per capita, it would be something like Malawi or Niger, the countries which have usually quite low literacy and atrocious numbers when it comes to healthcare or tertiary education, which means with any reasonable governance, I wouldn't even say like good governance, but someone who doesn't disrupt the economy by idiotic projects, North Korea has enormous potential, and that's one of the optimistic things for the future, I can say. But Kim Il-sung ran the country in a way which wasn't even a planned economy, because he never really respected plans. Because what he could have done, he could have looked at the plan and say, well, I don't like that indicator, rise it to 50%. And then the whole thing has to be recalculated to begin with. So what he wanted is a super centralized state in which he could have directly controlled everything he needed. Yeah, I think like if technology would have allowed to create a hive mind in North Korea, he would have probably go with it directly, and the only thing which prevented him is that there is no such technology available. But ultimately, yes, the idea was basically to be the queen bee. And one of his goals and his dreams, which I would say differs him greatly from his son and grandson, and especially grandson, is he never abandoned the idea of conquest of South Korea. And because the victory was snatched away from him, he was forced to sign that armistice. He never accepted it. In the 1960s, as a document discovered by a wonderful Chinese scholar, Chen Xiaohe, show he directly addressed China, asking for help in the second invasion of South Korea. And so the idea was, I control the economy, I control everything, and we'll have everything ready, we'll invade again, and we'll crush the South Koreans. He had enough cunning, enough shrewdness, never go with that silly idea again. He probably came closest in the 1960s. I'm not sure what would have happened in the if he succeeded in assassinating President Park Chung-hee in 1967. Maybe his hubris would have taken the good of him, and he actually would have started Second Korean War. But apart from that, he understood that he needs to secure the blessing of at least one great power, because he can't himself oppose the South Korean-American alliance, or he needs to throw the Americans out. We're quite pushy about that, and we definitely wanted the US Army to go. Well, I mean, his successors still wanted, if for entirely different reasons.
This is a stupid question, forgive me. Are there Russian troops or Chinese troops in North Korea today? Like we have in South Korea, there may be, say, 28,000 American troops, give or take, and they're officially here.
So not on a permanent basis. So the Soviet troops live in 48, the Chinese troops live in 58 after the war, and North Korea like to boost, like, see all the foreigners left here, they should also live in South Korea. I think there might be some Russian officers there, because we are currently very closely cooperating in Putin's war against Ukraine, but there is no permanent military presence. We would never allow for it.
Okay. One of my favourite sliding doors moment in Korean history, which you do actually mention in your book, and very few do, is the proposed meeting between Kim Il-sung and Kim Yong-sam in 1994.
Yep.
That was going to go ahead, and it seems like sometimes this has been forgotten. Obviously, Kim Dae-jung eventually met Kim Jong-il in 2000. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was like sort of an unprecedented event. But 6 years previous, that nearly happened, and sometimes I imagine what those photos would be like, or what that would have been like. Can you, just to pique my own curiosity, can you say something on how you see that event?
Well, I'm not sure if it would have been actually that eventful. It seems like he actively engaged in international diplomacy, but you saw photos of him with Jimmy Carter, didn't you? So you could imagine it could have been something like that, because people who knew Kim Il-sung by his in his twilight years, I talked to Kim Yong-hwan, who is now a human rights activist, and before that he was a far-left communist guy. Very interesting person to talk to, by the way. Mark, I really enjoyed the conversation. So he said, I met the great leader, I think it was 1991, and I sort of expected we would talk about the South Korean revolution, about the underground activities, maybe he'll no, instead of that he was talking about his own past. Yeah, so he was a very, very old man. So I think if he would have survived for a few months, we could have maybe signed some kind of agreement, which would probably be aimed at the United States, because remember they had a first nuclear crisis before that, and what I heard, the Clinton administration even briefly considered starting a war against North Korea, but it would probably be more like a declaration of intent. Well, I guess the biggest thing we could have allowed would be some South Korean money to flow in North Korea. Perhaps it could have saved some lives during a great famine, but once again, don't put that much into that summit. If anything would have been planned, it would have been planned long before, and Kim Il-sung would have definitely mentioned it, especially after he retired.
Yeah. I want to talk to you now about succession and how that works, because China and the Soviet Union both did it obviously very differently. The speech given by Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, you say this?
Yes, the Stalinization speech, what about it?
No speech in human history has changed the lives of so many people for the better in such a short space of time.
Yes, that's what I claim.
Yeah, it's very interesting to read. The succession in North Korea is very different from as we saw in the Soviet Union and China. So can you tell us about how that played out, how Kim Il-sung went from other ideas to putting Yura in charge?
So, well, first of all, like the Soviet Union pretended to be a democracy. So no Soviet leader had ever appointed a successor, although it seemed like some people toyed with that idea. And the first one to toy was actually not Joseph Stalin, but actually Nikita Khrushchev. Because he was similarly thinking about appointing a forgotten man called Frol Kozlov as his successor, but Kozlov suffered a stroke, and ultimately Khrushchev made a catastrophic mistake of appointing Leonid Brezhnev as his second command, and was in a few months very successfully couped by that man. But ultimately, in the USSR, there was always a scramble after a general secretary, or whichever was the position of the supreme leader after he passed away, and the new successor was usually decided upon in the next 24 hours, first as the chairman of funeral committee, then as a nominee of the Politburo, and finally as a general secretary as elected by the Central Committee. So in China, initially, Mao just governs the country, and in 1969 he comes with the idea of appointing a successor. First time it ever happens in a communist nation, so he appoints Vice Chairman Lin Biao at the time. By the way, not Marshal Lin Biao, because there are no military ranks there, because it's a mad time of cultural revolution, then there are no ranks in army. I think it shows the atmosphere. So, but Lin and Mao, they very soon begin to antagonize one another, because if you appoint someone as successor, you give that person a sort of degree of autonomy, of independence, and of his own power base. So that's similarly what happened in China. Ultimately, Lin tries to run away from the country, and his plane crashes in Mongolia, leaving no survivors. Seems Kim Il-sung learned two very important lessons from here. You can appoint a successor, but don't appoint someone who could betray you. He comes to the idea, I should appoint someone from my own family, because, well, if that person betrays me, that would be suicidal, wouldn't it? Because, if you say your dad is a terrible person, who are you? What are you doing here? And out of his 3 sons he had at the time, he picks as his eldest, probably because Yura, that was his early, Soviet name, probably named after Juche Zhukov. That's full form Juche, not necessarily Yuri. And later Kim Jong-il. So that man does his absolute best to show how unbelievably loyal he is to his father. He is an artsy womanizer, but at certain points he takes a very out-of-character job of the head of his dad's personal guards, just to show him, well, I might have hobbies, I might have women, but your security comes first. Great leader. Ironically, like you in Kim Jong-il's works, you can't see him using affectionate names like dad or even father. It's always like the great leader or the president. And Kim Jong-il starts to rise from roughly in 1971. It seems like the preliminary decision was made somewhere around it, and you can see it's in some later revealed documents first sign of his cult in 1972. He is opposed by his stepmother, who tries to antagonize and even promote herself. 1973, he counteracts in a very funny way by directing a film, a North Korean film, in which the main antagonist is a woman married to an honest carter, and the actress Han Gil-myeon, even has a physical resemblance to Kim Son-e's stepmother. So the evident message was to Kim Il-sung, looked at what happens if a nasty woman gets too much power. So ultimately a nasty woman is removed, and Kim Jong-il becomes a successor in 1974. He has 20 years to prepare for the succession. So for the first 6 years he is not revealed to the general public, although the information is leaked quite quickly, within 2 months. North Korea only recognizes it in 1980, and between 1977 and 1978 there is some crisis we don't know, but at the time the frequent frequency of hailing Kim Jong-il as a great success drops very significantly, never becomes zero, but the cult is greatly reduced, and it seems like Kim Il-sung is considering some second thoughts, and whatever the crisis is dissipated in 1979. Well, it seems it's one of a mystery, perhaps for the future generations, perhaps when and if they get access to North Korean archives. So in 1980, Kim Jong-il is proclaimed to the entire world as a successor. Lots of books are written in North Korea about it. In the 80s, he succeeds his father in 1994, and ultimately, if a bit reluctantly after he himself suffers a stroke in 2008, he appoints his youngest son, the successor, on this youngest son's birthday, on the 8th of January 2009, when Kim Jong-un turned 25.
Did I get the impression from your book, and I might have read it wrong, Fyodor, that Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un relatively liberate the country somewhat from Kim Il-sung's more totalitarian control, that there was some allowance, maybe not official, of sort of markets or selling? Is that a correct assessment? Or?
I'd say correct with Kim Jong-il, and with Kim Jong-un it's a bit more complicated. Yeah. So Kim Jong-il wasn't as cruel person as his father. I think like the closest analogy would be, I'm not sure if it would help, but in Turkmenistan you have a bit of the same dynamic. So the first tyrant, Saparmurat Niyazov, is a very totalitarian, and his successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, is not exactly whom you would call a liberal reformer, but he does relax the worst aspects of his predecessor's regime. So yes, Kim Jong-il did a few things. So he eased the degree of frenzy which was expected from the North Korean people to demonstrate. 70s, like say on ideological meetings in the 70s, it was perfectly normal to beat a person whom you criticize. In the 80s, not only that became like a bad thing to do. Even Kim Jong-il even directed a film where a person like screaming at such meeting was mocked for showing too much vigor. When he himself inherited the throne, probably the biggest reform he did was greatly reducing the system of family responsibility. So under Kim Il-sung, the standard practice is if you commit a political crime, your entire family gets punished. Under Kim Jong-il, it became a rare exception instead of a rule. In 2000, like the police officers in North Korea received a very explicit instruction from him: do not touch the families, leave them alone. And you probably know about like people, escapees from the north living here, they still send money usually to their relatives in the north. That would have been impossible under Kim Il-sung, because these people would have all been killed or sent to harsh labor camps. Kim Jong-un himself, I wouldn't say he is quite interested in political liberalization, but in his early years he implemented, or rather he accepted suggestions from below to implement some economic reforms aimed at decentralizing the economy, which had a positive effect, true, but it seems like after he got interested in different stuff like missiles, which occurred roughly around 2015. The reforms stopped and ultimately even like were partially reversed in his later years. So yeah, I think out of the three, the harshest one was Kim Il-sung by a wide margin, and the most liberal, if you can even like apply that to anyone, would be Kim Jong-il. I actually think that there might be a comparison if you look at the elite of Nazi Germany. I think Kim Il-sung was a bit similar in character to Reinhard Heydrich, while Kim Jong-il would be someone like Hermann Göring, and I'd say Kim Jong-un is a bit like Martin Bormann.
I must say that I love your analogies, whether they are Dungeons and Dragons or Shakespeare, Nazi Germany, and Turkmenistan. They're wonderful, Fyodor. I'm going to ask you a very trivial question now, which you might find facetious for a man of your scholarly learning, but does Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, does he intentionally seek to physically resemble his grandfather for elements of legitimacy, or is that silly?
Oh, that's actually a great question, because I think you can't answer this with a simple yes or no. So in his very early years, when he is a potent successor of Kim Jong-il, it seems that what Kim Jong-il wants him to do. So he, in 2009 to 11, when he already appears, like especially since 2010, when he appears like not only inside North Korea but to us foreigners, footage around him makes very sure that he resembles Kim Il-sung. But when he becomes his own ruler, when his dad dies, it seems like he abandons the whole thing. I think the real difference between him and his dad is that Kim Jong-il was one of the architects of the cult. He was the man who built it with his father and for his father and partially for himself. But Kim Jong-un never got to put any input. He inherited the system, and it was essentially forced upon him. And imagine it like you are a complete and unchallenged autocrat, but there is one part of the country, one thing which you cannot change. And of course it would irritate you, because am I not like the ruler here? Can't I do what I want? And you can see Kim Jong-un, who is it's quite subtle. It's not like anything as radical as it was like in the USSR, basically in most like authoritarian countries. You can see him slowly reducing the level of worship of his august predecessors. His dad, he is very, very petty. So my favorite story is how he proclaims his father Eternal General Secretary, mirroring the proclamation of Kim Il-sung as Eternal President, but with a difference. Like Kim Jong-il did it in a very somber and seemingly authentic way, while Kim Jong-un bored to death read his speech and I suggest we proclaim Comrade Kim Jong-il as Eternal General Secretary of our party. I think that it would be very important to remember his legacy, and well, it is. So in my favorite episode of Doctor Who, there is a question: how many seconds in eternity? And for this answer, you could probably make a calculation, because the eternity is already ended. So it started in 2012, and by 2021, Kim Jong-il was removed from the position of Eternal General Secretary, because Kim Jong-un assumed that position for himself. He had absolutely no reason to do that apart from their sheer pettiness. And that's it. So the second one is a bit of a de-deification of Kim Il-sung. Remember, at the very beginning of our conversation, I said a part of it, he is presented not just as a wonderful leader, but as a semi-divine figure. Something it seemingly later irritated Kim Jong-un, and he even passed an instruction: do not deify the leader, do not say anything supernatural. So was a recent film which definitely has a very strong imprint of Kim Jong-un himself, called 72 Hours. It's a very funny thing to have a look at. It's a North Korean narrative of the first days of the Korean War, with the evil and scheming South Koreans, with Americans attacking and receiving a counter attack from the North. You can see Dresnik brothers, the sons of an American soldier who had defected to North Korea, playing villains there.
Wow!
Yeah, it's a wonderful film because it's so crude and it's so funny. But what really was very impressive, because Kim Il-sung doesn't command divine presence here. He doesn't appear and everyone looks at him as something as a lightning stroke here. No, he talks like a very reasonable, a lovely Carter from a North Korean film. He can see him doing very human things, like looking at a photo of himself and his son, taking his clothes on, talking in a very friendly majesty to his subordinates, which was quite unthinkable at the time. So you see, basically, Kim Jong-il seemingly wanted Kim Jong-un to perpetuate a myth. And Kim Jong-un was more willing to perpetuate a cult, but perhaps not a myth. Well, at least not to a full extent.
It's interesting how that deification is being reversed a little bit, and also how family dynamics play into all this, with mothers and mothers-in-law and things like that you play out in your book. Another facetious question: you do well to dispel an Orientalist myth of Juche and say how it's basically empty. Does the songbun system exist? You don't really cover that as much in your book, but this is a personal curiosity.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I don't call it Sonbun because I try to avoid loan words in the book. That's actually I learned from Richard Evans, a historian of the Third Reich, who had in his introduction to his books, like, I don't use borrowed German words because Gauleiter doesn't look like regional leader to us. It looks like an evil Nazi. But to a German person, it's just like regional leader. So for the same reason, I call it like origins or like system of social stratification. But it's very much in there. Like, I think the early version is discussed, let me remember, in chapter 9, and the updated one, I think it's chapter 12. Yes, it's very real. So what it is, it's that each and every North Korean has 3 statuses assigned to that person at the age of 17: the origins, the social status, and the layer, which is calculated from the two. And ultimately, under Kim Il-sung, you were given one of the 3 classes, which were called a bit differently at a different point of history, but like at one point it was like nuclear, basic, and hostile. The degree of loyalty, good, problematic, bad. Under Kim Jong-il, the system was expanded to 5 classes, which is not widely known, but that is also something. So the stratification originates in the 1950s. Initially, like the first version, were the 3 classes of equal size. Then the modern system originates in 1967, as you probably would have guessed. And initially, a hostile class of suspicious people is big, but it rapidly was shrinking. Because thing is, it's not really like an Indian caste system, because like once you are like a Shudra, you're forever a Shudra. North Korean, first, like you can theoretically upgrade your like Sonbun standing, although it's not really easy. And more importantly, like say like someone is a factionalist, he is shot. Okay, his children get status of family of a factionalist, very bad. They are sent to the countryside to work. Their children, meanwhile, live in a workers' family, and they get in a better like social status of a worker. And like probably from the 4th generation, it won't even matter. So if each and every generation, your like stigma washes away wherever you go. But of course, for each and every person whose life is already broken, it's a small compensation. But yeah, just again, it's not something which is as cruel as it was in India in traditional society. But yeah, the system is very much in there. Like the highest group is now called the special class, and it's reserved for Kim Il-sung's comrade in Manchuria and their direct descendants. And interestingly enough, the royal family, the Kims, they don't have a Sonbun, so they're exempted from the whole system, and their marriages are not registered and they're not in any databases. So I guess the possible analogy would be like King Charles III is considered to be a bit different in the United Kingdom to each and every other person, and like if he commits a crime, it will probably require the abolition of monarchy to put him to justice. And that's in a very different way. In North Korea, the royal family is not something to be registered. So when we say Kim Jong-il's wife, it's probably like the person who lived with him for a substantial number of time, because we do not register his marriages.
It's too personal, it's too individual, it's not enough. I do, by the way, feel the empathy that you have for those who have suffered under these throughout the book, Fyodor, which I think is very admirable. I've asked you a couple of questions about appearance and about social stratification. Is there something that you think people generally misunderstand about North Korea? This is a very open question, and just as we come towards the end, but is there something that, as a scholar, as somebody who has done a lot of work, that you see repeated or that comes up frequently and you think that's just not quite right about North Korea, that's a misunderstanding, miscomprehension?
Well, I guess the whole talk about Juche ideology, which you mentioned, because thing is, it's in the West, I guess Bruce Cummings should be credited for misinterpretation, because like 4 times in his different books he talks about it in a very strange way. It's like it's the very definition of Koreanness, of the Korean soul, which a Westerner cannot understand. Which is say sounds like a bit, I don't know, like racist perhaps, when you assume that different ethnicities have different cognitive abilities, and it's physically impossible for ethnic group 1 to understand something which ethnic group 2 can. Yes, I mean, it's sort of auto-racism because he puts himself not in the superior race but in the inferior one, but still it's very strange. So the word itself, as like Brian Myers put in his lesser known work on like the Juche myth, originates in Korean language through Japanese from the word shutai, which is a translation for a very Western, German concept of the word Subjekt, which is translated into English as a subject, but is a very, very obsolete meaning of an obscure meaning of the word, is like the actor, not the one who is acted upon, but the actor. So it has an opposite word in Korean language, kakche, an object, or the one he is acted upon. It's quite like a normal word, which is used both in philosophy. That's how we translate it, even in North Korea, the word from German language back when Marx was published in North Korea from 1947. Marx's work and like Lenin's work has never been republished, by the way. It federal subjects of Russia, like the four like republics and other districts, are called Yeonban Juche in Korean. The same word is used. So thing is, it's a very shallow ideology. Like the North Korean ideology itself is bigger than that. Of course, like the Soviet ideology wasn't just Marxist-Leninist, or say, like, I don't know, the idea of United States it wouldn't be just liberal democracy, would it? Yeah, but if you look at it, how they actually describe it, they put one sentence, man is master of all things, which is completely meaningless. It doesn't mean nothing. Start dancing around it with craziness, like if there is a translation of a very long paragraph of that in the book, but sort of like Juche thought is a great philosophical thought which shows that a man is the master of all things by elucidating that there is man and there are things, and man is lords upon these things, being the master of all things. For the first time, it shows the great principle of man being the master of all things by shedding light on the idea that to the things a man is a master. And that's it. That's it. It's not something like the Juche study groups with whole things. Like you can summon a person like from there, like Dermot Hudson, say, and ask him what is that, and either that person would just start parroting like other North Korean narratives, like self-reliance, like the independence, or that person would just say, "Man, are the master of all things," because it's not even self-reliance. It's something like that thingy, which is supposed to be hailed as the greatest philosophical thought ever. And if you look at what we actually do in most of the so-called studies of the Jewish thought, it's just hailing it as the greatest thing which has ever existed in human history. So it's basically one of the many ways for the cult to manifest itself. It's not a coherent philosophy as is like Mao Zedong thought or Marxism-Leninism. Once again, let's not forget, we are not talking about a person who was highly educated. We are talking about a middle school dropout, Kim.
Yeah, and your cynicism comes through wonderfully when you translate that paragraph and say this is essentially nothing, the master of all things. I feel that you mentioned Brian Myers, who had some very nice words to say about you in a recent correspondence. What I've noticed, Fyodor, is that when I do conversations like this, judging by how people react to the person, not necessarily even by reading their books sometimes, but judging, there's a political and ideological spectrum in Korean studies, and we've mentioned Bruce Cummings, and I see this, and I see people reacting to conversations online. I'm not sure how you might see this, but where does this book sit in the Korean studies field? Do you have a sense that there is people on the left and the right? There's people that sort of have this view where all communism is bad and America are the saviors, and then there's a sort of a more negative anti-American approach.
Well, I guess, like, the thing is, like, I've never in my life have been to the United States for the beginning, so I'm not really a part of the community in itself. I mean, I publish a lot in English, but lots of the people I have not even met. But I say there is a school of thought which I profoundly disagree with. This is started by Professor Cummings, to a certain extent expanded upon by Susie Kim, and also by the disgraced plagiarist Charles Armstrong. These people tend to ignore Soviet documents when it comes to the 1940 and have a narrative of the so-called North Korean Revolution. I'd say there had never been any revolution there, and it's complete and utter nonsense. So revolution implies when a certain, like, people rise up and topple the government. Yeah. It has never occurred. Like, at no point in time did the Korean people march in the Governor General Palace and forced the governor out. Governor Abe surrendered to the American army in a very formal ceremony. Even after the surrender of the Imperial Japan, the Japanese colonial rule was never overthrown. There was no revolution. In the 40s, all the decision making was made by, especially in the northern zone, by the Soviets. Kim Il-sung was probably, like, I don't know, number 5 or 6 in the administration as a small of an honorary advisor than anyone else. And the problem is, like, the people say, oh, well, we read sources from the 1940s. No, you do not read sources. You read official North Korean publications. Like, if you want to read sources, read lots and lots of testimonies which have been published in South Korea by people who escaped the country in the 40s. Read memoirs. Read testimonies with, of the Soviet people like General Lebedev, who actually ran the country. There are lots and lots of sources, and finally read just the official documents of the Soviet administration, all of them, and you'll find out there has never been a revolution. So please, like, I would be very thankful if one of the impact of this book would be that sobriquet would finally be let me just repeat. I would be very thankful if the result of my book, that sobriquet, North Korean Revolution, would finally disappear.
And I think that's why people such as Stephen Mercado describe you as joining the exclusive club of polyglot academics, because you conduct research but you have the linguistic skills to back it up. And I think sometimes that goes missing. You know, we all struggle with our different abilities and things like that, but it's an amazing thing that you achieve, and I'm sure it doesn't come easy to master these languages, but then to spend time poring over the memoirs and the archives, and you can feel that you've been to archives in various different countries and poured through them in different languages, and it gives you a perspective.
Thank you. So on the languages, I would say, like, I'm really fluent in only 2 foreign languages, which would be English and Korean. But importantly, like, I can read in several hours. It's not easy. I mean, my Chinese or Japanese are by no means fluent, but I know, like, the basics, and I try. And I greatly respect people who, like, also start doing research in languages they speak. So some reason I've noticed a lot of colleagues who have, like, reasonable skill in, say, Chinese language, and they don't use it unless they're absolutely fluent. Thing is, like, especially for historian, reading is the most important skill. So do not ignore that, especially, like, in modern era when we're getting more and more, like, sophisticated tools of automated translation. So you can translate the whole text, you can look at the most important part of it, and you can cross-check it with the original. Even if you, like for foreign language, even if you studied it for a month. Well, I studied Chinese and Japanese for much longer than that, but still, like, even if, like, you are, say, A1 level, like the most basic one, you can still probably understand something. So please, let us not ignore foreign languages, and especially to my English level speaking colleagues, let us not become a small village which only quotes themselves, because it's really a plague of so many disciplines when like, you write something, say, in Portuguese, and 80% of your quotes come from Portuguese language sources. No, it's easy, it's very tempting, but once again, we live in a very big world, and for Korean studies, the central language is Korean, and so let us quote and let us try to read at least our colleagues in all the different languages we could possibly reach.
Hear, hear, sir. I'm going to, as we come towards the end, I'm going to read a short paragraph, Fyodor, just from the end of your book, and ask you to respond to it, because I think it's important. You end your book about Kim Il-sung by saying this: "It would be wrong to say that Kim Il-sung was a man of pure evil. He was a brave and cunning man, but he was not completely incapable of kindness, forgiveness and mercy. Yet there can be little doubt that Kim Il-sung is the darkest figure in all of Korea's history. He was the man who instigated the most destructive war Korea has ever seen, the man who created one of the most repressive states in human history, the man whose economic policy ended in mass famine, and the man who did his utmost to ensure this order would be preserved after his death. He was, to a certain extent, both a communist and a nationalist. Ultimately, however, his loyalty was not to an ideology or a specific group, but rather to himself. His ego and his cult had a mutually amplifying effect that eventually led the great leader to completely cease believing that he might be wrong on any issue. He made himself believe that any problems the country faced came from the stupidity, laziness or ineptitude of his subordinates, not from the way he ran the country. Yet the legacy he cared about most, the social and political system he had built, has outlived him. The regime, now led by Kim Il-sung's grandson, remains unyielding in the face of all challenges, dominating the lives of over 20 million North Koreans, with no apparent end in sight." It's powerful, Fyodor.
Thank you. Well, you just read the conclusion to the book, its final words.
And I think there's a brilliant way to bring the conversation to an end. I ask all my guests this: any recommendations, Fyodor? So, books, movies, music. It can be about Korea. It can be about anything. It can be episodes of Doctor Who. 2 or 3 recommendations for the listeners, please, Fyodor.
Doctor Who Heaven Sent, definitely. That's the episode where I was quoting. Well, I mean, you asked, so yes, I'm answering, but on the closest subject on North Korea, Barbara Demick's book is awesome. Yes. I definitely recommend it, especially if, I was going to say as an introduction about North Korean studies, but I actually interrupt and correct myself because I read it, I think after 7 years of studying North Korea, it was still very amazing. The chapter I actually enjoyed the most was how people reacted to the death of Kim Il-sung. I quote Demick's book in mine. I think that's something which has never been truly studied in Korean language, and that's where your skills really excelled. On Kim Jong-un, I think no one has written anything better than Anna Fifield. And here, book has lots of interesting stuff when it comes out of Brian Mice's book. I think a Juche myth is perhaps one of the most ignored, but I actually think that's really a cool one. I mean, I think Brian is a bit too focused on the nationalist part in North Korean state ideology, but apart from that aspect, I profoundly recommend it. What else? Shilamiyoshi Yage, The Brothers at War, probably the best on the Korean War, the I think that probably would be it of what I remember quite now. I am terribly sorry to anyone I have forgotten. I mean, we have been talking for a few hours. Yeah. So, yeah.
Can I ask you about one book? Honik Kwon's book, Charismatic North Korean Politics. Have you read that? Do you have an opinion?
No, I have not, so I couldn't possibly comment.
Okay, thank you.
What do you think, off the record?
Everything's completely on the record. I completely enjoyed it. I really enjoyed Honik Kwon's After the Korean War, and his book. It's a co-written book, and I forget the co-writer of it. But I read it, and I need to read it again, but it humanizes North Korean people as it portrays them in this sort of double stereotype of being walking bullets for a totalitarian regime, but then also humans that have been purposefully transformed, often against their will, into these kind of walk-in bullets that have to serve a purpose. And it's I just enjoyed it. I wasn't sure how you would respond to it.
Well, if that's a message, that's awesome, I would say. I've been in North Korea only twice. I can't go again because I'm now a South Korean citizen. But of course, North Koreans are humans. You can feel it very much so. And one of the controversial statements, I would say, even people who work in places like the secret police, even they are humans.
Yeah.
Not always the best of them, but once again, you can't alter human nature. No totalitarian state has ever succeeded in this.
Fyodor, from one human to another. Thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure.